How are you today? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I want to share again the Bill of Rights Primer, a series guidebook to the American Bill of Rights by Askil Reed Amar and Les Adams. The first chapter of creation. First things first, how our nationalist and states' rights traditions and the precise way judges have incorporated the Bill of Rights into the 14th Amendment have slanted our view of the original Bill of Rights. How the first two amendments proposed by the first Congress failed to achieve ratification. How debate over their provision revealed the philosophical differences between Federalist and anti-Federalist forces that were to influence the content of the other amendments. The Founders' Bill of Rights was, unsurprisingly, a creature of its time. Yet, because it is 18th century words play such an active role in 21st century legal discourse, we may at times forget that more than 2 centuries separate us from the word that birthed the bill. More than 2 centuries separate us from the word that birthed the bill. Before we fix our gaze on the 18th century document, let us briefly consider how 19th and 20th century events and ideas have organized our legal thinking, predisposing us to see certain features of the original Bill of Rights and to overlook others. And before we rush to examine the words that are first in our modern Bill of Rights, let us briefly consider the words that were first on the original Bill of Rights. Modern blinders constricting our view of the original Bill of Rights. Our nationalist and states' rights tradition. Modern Americans inhabit a world whose constitutional terrain is dominated by a series of landmark Supreme Court cases that invalidate state laws and administrative practices in the name of individual constitutional rights. Many Americans now embrace a tradition that views the state government as a major threat to individual and minority rights, and federal officials, especially federal courts, as the special guardians of those rights. This nationalist tradition has deep roots. Over the course of the 2 centuries, the Supreme Court has struck down the state and local action with far more regularity than it has invalidated acts of our federal government. Early in the 20th century, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes declared, "I do not think the United States would come to an end if we lost our power to declare an act of Congress void. I do think the Union would be imperiled if we could not make that declaration as to the laws of the several states." Verse 3. Justice Holmes had reached maturity during the Civil War era, and he understood from first-hand experience that the constitutional amendments adopted following the war, particularly the 14th Amendment, reflected a similar suspicion of state governments. The nationalist tradition, however, is far older than Reconstruction. Its deepest roots lie in the Philadelphia, not Appomattox. An important goal of the Federalist framers in their Philadelphia Convention was to forge a strong set of federal enforceable rights against abusive state governments. Several of these limits on the states appear in Article 1, Section 10 of the original Constitution. Indeed, the Federalists' efforts to create a strong central government drew much of its life from their dissatisfaction with small-scale politics and their belief, as exemplified in James Madison's Federalist Number 10, that an enlargement of the government's geographic sphere would improve the caliber of public decision-making. Alongside this nationalist tradition, however, lie a states' rights tradition also championed by Madison that extolled the ability of local governments to protect citizens against abuse by central authorities. The foundation of these state rights tradition are even older than those of the nationalist tradition, indeed older than the Union itself. In the 17th century, British North America began not as a single continent, while entitled by a series of different and distinct colonies, each founded at different moment with a distinct charter, a distinct history, a distinct immigration pattern, a distinct set of laws and legal institutions. For example, in 1760, Virginia was legally speaking an accomplished fact. Its House of Burgesses had been meeting since the 1620s. But America, as a legal entity, was still waiting to be born. Also, during the fateful years between the end of the French and Indian War and the beginning of the Revolutionary one, colonial governments took the lead in protecting their citizens from perceived abuses of the English Parliament. Our states' rights traditions are older than the Union itself. Colonial legislatures kept a close eye on the central government, sounded public alarms wherever they saw oppression in the works, and organized political, economic, and ultimately military opposition to perceived British evils. In helping to draft the Constitution and Bill of Rights, Madison was quite careful to identify the limits as well as the affirmative scope. The state rights. State governments could monitor the federal one and mobilize political opposition to federal laws, seen as oppressive, but no state entity could unilaterally nullify those laws or secede from the Union. Moreover, Madison's scheme gave the federal government a crucial role in protecting citizens from abusive state governments. Later spokesmen for the state rights position, like John C. Calhoun and Jefferson Davis, disregarded these vital limits. Not only did their arguments on behalf of nullification and secession misread the Constitution's federal structure, but these arguments were deployed on behalf of slavery, the ultimate violation of the human dignity. The Civil War was the second war fought on American soil over the intertwined issues of states' rights and human rights. But this time the relation between the two sets of rights was different, in sharp contrast to the revolutionaries' rhetoric of the 1770s. The rebels' rhetoric of federalism in the 1860s came to be seen as a conflicting with rather than supportive of true freedom. Modern Americans are still living with the legacy of the Civil War, with modern rhetorical battle lines tracking those laid down more than a century ago. Nationalists recognize the need for a strong national government to protect individuals against abusive state governments, but often ignore the threat posed by a monstrous central regime unchecked by competing power centers. Modern Americans are still living with the legacy of the Civil War. Conversely, states' rightists wax eloquent about the dangers of national government run rampant by regularly deploying the rhetoric of states' rights to defend the state's wrongs. What has been lost in this modern debate is the crucial Madisonian insight that localism and liberty can sometimes work together rather than at cross purposes. This is one of the themes that we hope will emerge from our fresh look at Madison's Bill of Rights. Localism and liberty can sometimes work together. The incorporation process. As noted earlier, through the 14th Amendment, almost all the provisions of the Bill of Rights have come to be incorporated against the states, effectively changing its meaning. Whereas the Bill of Rights was originally a set of larger structural guarantees applying only against the federal government, it has now become a bulwark of rights against all government conduct, both federal and state. Whereas the Bill of Rights was originally drafted to protect the general citizen from a possible unrepresentative government, it has been pressed into the service of protecting vulnerable minorities from dominant social majorities. In addition, the precise way in which judges have incorporated the Bill of Rights into the 14th Amendment has had the unfortunate effect on blinding us to the ways in which the bill has been transformed. Courts and legal scholars now appear to be applying the Bill of Rights directly against the states. The 14th Amendment is mentioned only in passing, if at all, like people with glasses who often forget that they are wearing them. Most people read a Bill of Rights through the lens of the 14th, with realizing how powerful that lens has reflected what they see. It is time then to take off these glasses and see how the Bill of Rights looked before Reconstruction. Only then can we fully appreciate some of its most important features as originally conceived. When we remove our modern blinders, a rather different Bill of Rights comes into view. What follows is the upcoming chapters may sometimes startle modern readers, but upon reflection, we should not be surprised to learn that those present that the creation inhabited a world very different from our own, and only after we understand their world and their original vision can we begin to assess in a self-conscious and systematic way how much of this vision, if any, has survived or should survive subsequent constitutional developments. The founders inhabited a world very different than our own. The first failed amendments. The Bill of Rights proposed by the first Congress consisted of 12 amendments, yet only the last 10 were ratified by the requisite 3/4 of the state legislatures in 1791, thereby becoming valid to all intents and purpose as part of the Constitution. The first two failed amendments are nevertheless worthy of re-examination for the insights they provide into the thinking of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists in the first Congress. An examination of the first two failed amendments. The original First Amendment size and representative character of the House of the Representatives. The words that modern Americans refer to as the First Amendment really weren't first in the minds of the first Congress. Read the words that began the Bill of Rights. Article the First. After the first enumeration required by the first article of the Constitution, there shall be one representative for every 30,000, until the number shall amount to 100, after which the proposition shall be so regulated by Congress that there shall be no less than 100 representatives, nor less than a representative for every 40,000 persons, until the number of representatives shall amount to 200, after which the proposition shall be so regulated by Congress that there shall no be less than 200 representatives, nor more than one representative for every 50,000 persons. This would be First Amendment obviously deals with the structure and organization of the government, not individual rights. It is an explicit modification of the structural rules set out in Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, which mandates that the number of representatives shall not exceed one for every 30,000 constituents. Anti-Federalist objections, Federalist responses. One of the Anti-Federalists' most important concerns. This amendment responds to one of the Anti-Federalists' most important cluster of concerns, demographic and geographic, the numerical size of the citizenry, and the spatial sweep of the nation. The Anti-Federalists adhered to classical political theory that suggested that republics could thrive only in geographically and demographically small societies, where the citizens would be shaped by a common climate and culture, would hold homogeneous worldviews, would know each other, and could meet face to face to deliberate on public issues. Models of such republics included Greek city-states and pre-imperial Rome. James Madison and the Federalists stood this classical view on its head by claiming that a large and modestly diverse society could actually produce a more stable republic than could a small and homogeneous city or state. Madison Federalist number 10 is today recognized as the most elegant and incisive presentation of this revolutionary idea. But in fact, the entire introductory section of the Federalists sought to confront squarely the Anti-Federalist concern about size. In the Federalist number 2, for example, John Jay noted the many ways in which white Americans share a basic uniformity that constituted them as one people, ethnically, culturally, linguistically, historically, commercially, and geographically. A related anti-federalist objection to the Constitution was that Congress too small, too rich, too refined. The anti-federalists felt that fear because the legislature was so small. Only great men with reputation, spanning wide geographic areas, could secure election. Thus, for anti-federalists, the Constitution was at heart an aristocratic document, notwithstanding its ringing populist proclamation, "We the people," and dramatic ratification by a special elected popular convention. Anti-federalists feared that the aristocrat who would control Congress would have an insufficient sense of sympathy with and connectedness to ordinary people. Unlike state legislators, these lordly men in Congress would disdain the lowly constituents, who would in turn lose faith in the national government. In the end, the new government would be obliged to rule through corruption, force, and fear, with monopolies and standing armies, rather than through mutual confidence. For anti-federalists, the Constitution was at heart an aristocratic document. The anti-federalists were not simply concerned that Congress was too small, relatively too small, to be truly representative of the great diversity of the nation. Congress was also too small, absolutely too small, to be immune from the secret plots and intrigue. The Federalists were not obvious to this concern, as Madison's own language in the Federalist shows. In fact, at the Philadelphia Convention, Madison had championed a motion to double the initial size of the House of Representatives from 65 to 130 members. A majority of a quorum of 65 members was too small a number to represent the whole inhabitants of the US states. They would not possess enough of the confidence of the people, and would be too sparsely taken from the people to bring with them all the local information which would be frequently wanted. However, this motion went down to defeat in July. But after the Constitution was ratified, Madison returned to the issue of congressional size, with a proposed First Amendment that, at least in the short run, promised a larger, more representative, less aristocratic Congress. Despite the Federalists' attempt to reach a compromise with the Anti-Federalists on these size-related issues, the amendment fell one state short of ratification. The key state appears to be Delaware, the only state that ratified the last 10 amendments while rejecting the first. The original First Amendment fell one state short of the ratification. Whatever its reasons for concerning the first Congress' First Amendment, the legislative history is sparse, but because of its tiny population and limited room for growth, Delaware had selfish reason to favor a small House of Representatives as possible. We do well to remember that only a single state, and tiny of that, stood between the 10 success stories of amendments, 10 and 12, and the failure to the original amendment first. The original Second Amendment restricting economic self-dealing. One of the principal objectives of the Bill of Rights frames was to ensure that the official to whom the people have delegated power to run the government's day-to-day affairs would be restrained from self-dealing contrary to their interested and expressed wishes of the people. The original Second Amendment was obviously directed to minimize such activity. Article the Second, no law wherein the compensation for the services of the senators and the representatives shall take effect until after an election of representatives shall have intervened. This amendment went down to defeat in the 1790s. Only 6 states' legislatures ratified its words. The likely reason for its failure to achieve ratification is that whereas the original First Amendment had focused on a key difference between an aristocratic Congress and more democratic state legislatures, so that the state legislators could cheerfully support the First Amendment without calling into question their own legitimacy. The original Second Amendment's issue of legislative salaries hit closer to home, close to their own pocketbooks. How could the state legislators vote for this amendment without also triggering public demand for similar amendments to their respective state constitution, regulating their own salaries? However, the original Second Amendment apparently lived to fight another day. After lying dormant and presumed dead for nearly 2 centuries, this Rip Van Winkle Amendment reawaked to a burst of attention and flurry of ratification in the 1980s and 1990s. In 1992, more than 200 years after being proposed, the amendment was officially proclaimed valid as the 27th rather than the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. The original Second Amendment also went down to defeat, but the original Second Amendment lived to fight another day. That's what we have. We have to fight for our Constitution, for the Constitution of America, the world of creation. Have a blessed day. Bye-bye.